This week, methane becomes the new focus to slow the pace of global warming. The other greenhouse gas is 80 times more harmful to the atmosphere than CO2.
About a quarter of all the human-caused warming that we've experienced to date is because of methane emissions by humans.
Methane hunters. Activists and scientists sniff for hidden leaks before they cook the planet any further.
The oil and gas industry is not containing their methane gas.
I'm seeing a lot of emissions coming from the tank valves.
And Turkmenistan's gas problem. The Central Asian nation is the world's fourth biggest methane emitter. How can you convince an authoritarian government that climate change matters?
He is almost a parody of a dictator with complete power over every part of that society. Turkmenistan's engagement with international environmental bodies is very minimal.
I'm Kaylee Lines in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green. A lot of the blame for the climate problem goes to the burning of fossil fuels, which adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. The greenhouse gas acts like a blanket, enveloping the planet, raising global average temperatures, and unleashing catastrophes that very few are prepared to deal with. But carbon dioxide, CO2, is only half the problem. As the world heads toward zeroing out the impact of all greenhouse gases, attention will have to be given to all of the gases, and especially methane. Bloomberg's Zachary Miter explains.
If you think about the fossil fuels that are down in the ground, one of the main ones is actually methane. And what we refer to as natural gas is essentially a combination of gases that come up from the ground that are mostly methane, with a few other gases thrown in there. Methane is a super powerful greenhouse gas. It has about 80 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide over a 20-year period. And scientists think that about a quarter of all the human-caused warming that we've experienced to date is because of methane emissions by humans. We do a lot of different things to put methane in the atmosphere. Raising livestock is a big contributor. Growing rice is another one. Landfills, sewage, there's all different kinds of things. And then, of course, oil and gas.
That was Bloomberg Investigations reporter Zachary Miter. We will hear back from Zachary later on in the program as he followed a group of so-called methane hunters. Well, on June 4th, the European Union's climate czar, Frans Timmermans, gave a speech promoting the world's most ambitious green agenda. The same day, a satellite observed a massive plume of methane from a pipeline connecting Russia and Western Europe. The release had the same short-term climate impact as the annual emissions of 90,000 cars in the UK. It highlights a central contradiction in Europe's energy policy. Despite its lofty ambitions, it remains deeply reliant on pipelines of Russian gas, which are prone to leaking. But solving the problem relies on its detection. We spoke with Claus Zehner from the European Space Agency about measuring the release of greenhouse gases from far above the Earth.
We are using, at the European Space Agency, we are using space by sending up satellites there in order to look back on what is happening on Earth. Sentinel-5B is a Copernicus Sentinel mission, the first one on atmosphere, and it has on board a spectrometer, which is called Tropomi. And the spectrometer is just collecting the light that is reflected from the Earth's surface and from the atmosphere, and is comparing this light with sunlight. So what you see within these measurements, when there are trace gases in the atmosphere, you see absorption features because, like methane is absorbing light. Within these measurements, you have absorption features. You compare these measurements coming from Earth with measurements to the sun, that this is outside the atmosphere. So these measurements are not affected by the atmosphere. And you just look at these differences, which are the absorption features. And for example, if you have a huge dip in your measurements, you have a strong concentration of methane. So it's quite a simple technique.
So would your systems pick up any natural methane emissions, or are what you are seeing really all just man-made?
No, what we also see, for example, we see clearly with the Sentinel-5B Twop-Omi measurements, we see emissions from wetlands. We have some examples for over Africa. We are also trying to look now in areas if we see emissions from livestock. We are just testing an area over California, but there you also have emissions from oil and gas. So we see emissions of natural emissions, but we also see very strongly emissions coming from oil and gas industry, for example.
So preventing leaks potentially from happening in the future is one thing. It's another thing to stop leaks that are currently happening. When you do these measurements, how quickly could that translate into the plugging of a methane leak?
That's not so straightforward to be answered because there are different cases. We have seen with our measurements, we have seen some leaks, and even sometimes we had to find out who is the company who is responsible, let's say, for this pipeline or for this special oil well. And sometimes we realized that they were not even aware by themselves that based on COVID, there was less maintenance or things going on like this, or there was less usage of methane and more gas has been released. So it's not easy to give a clear message on this, but the important thing is that we provide this information to the people who are responsible where these things are happening, and then depending on where it is it in a pipeline in Siberia, is it somewhere in an area where people are living close by? Then depending on the circumstances, you get a different response time and how to close or to correct for these leaks.
What circumstances do you find most often? Where do a lot of leaks center from?
Yeah, we see really on regular basis, we see leaks over pipelines, and we also see really emissions coming from oil and gas industry. And there are huge areas, for example, in the Permian Basin in the US, where these leaks are happening. Sometimes even methane is coming out and they're even flaring it, and you also see emissions from this. So it's really mainly coming from oil and gas industry. We are also testing Sentinel-5B to look at emissions from waste dump, but these sources are much smaller. We average our data, so we're using kind of time series, and we see sometimes a signal, but it's not so easy to identify where the hotspot is. And we are working together with other companies. For example, there's the Canadian company GHGSat. They are providing only few measurements in space per orbit, but they have a high spatial resolution. So you can combine Twop-Omi measurements of methane, and you can use GHGSat measurements to zoom in. And based on this, we have, for example, we have detected methane emission from a waste dump in Argentina, for example. But it's just one example of an application. And it's also important to work together with other first space agencies, but also in this case, it's a commercial agency, but also with ground-based people and with the modeling community. So it's the satellites from ESA, from the European Copernicus program, they are providing a contribution to the general picture. With satellites alone, you don't solve everything, but it's a contribution, and you have to work together to get the information out that is needed in order to be able to mitigate.
All right, Claus Zehner of the European Space Agency, thank you so much for your time today.
Up next, we travel to the Permian Basin, where we follow the Methane Hunters. A group of scientists and activists are looking for gas spills into the atmosphere before they cook the planet any further. This is Bloomberg Green.
I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in New York, and here's everything you need to know in Green this week. 3 scientists win the Nobel Prize for Physics for their breakthroughs in how we understand the planet's climate. Syukuro Manabe of Princeton University and Klaus Hasselmann of the Max Planck Institute were awarded half the prize for their climate models. The other half went to a third scientist, Giorgio Perizzi from the Sapienza University in Rome. Also, rich countries fell $10 billion short in climate climate finance pledges. Bloomberg sources say that a handful of European nations plan to close this shortfall ahead of COP26. Over a decade ago, developed countries promised to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 to help poor countries deal with the worst impacts of global warming. And finally, the world has lost 14% of its coral in just over a decade, mainly due to climate change. A sweeping international report on the state of the world's coral underscores the impact of global warming on coral reefs. But it also says that some of them could be recovered and saved if humans move quickly to rein in greenhouse gases. And that's your Green Brief. Kaylee?
Thanks, Jen. Methane leaks are not just a problem in Europe. Frackers in America's largest oil field are letting massive amounts of natural gas spill into the atmosphere. Scientists and activists are trying to find the leaks and get them plugged before they cook the planet any further. Bloomberg's Investigations reporter Zachary Miter followed those methane hunters in the Texan Permian Basin.
Oil and gas industry started this fracking boom. And at first they were encroaching into neighborhoods and into backyards.
Not in our backyard, not in anyone's backyard. Get the frack out of our lives.
Now their emissions, their pollution that they release from these sites is a problem for everyone around the globe because methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas.
The Permian Basin in Texas, it's by far the most productive field in the country. I think more than half the country's drill rigs were operating there over the past few years. And Sharon Wilson goes out there every couple months with this camera that can see methane, this invisible pollutant.
If you could see the emissions with your naked eye, there never would have been a fracking boom. You cannot see it without this camera. I'm a certified optical gas imaging thermographer and a field advocate for earthworks. I use an optical gas imaging camera. It's manufactured by FLIR, which stands for Forward-Looking Infrared.
It's a $100,000 camera that uses infrared sensors to produce an image that shows methane.
I make visible the invisible emissions out here to prove that the oil and gas industry is not containing their methane gas.
I'm seeing a lot of emissions coming from the tank valves. Sometimes the industry will say that's steam. That's just an excuse industry makes. They use the same camera that we use. They don't use it to go find steam.
Sharon was not really an environmentalist. She used to work for an oil services company back in the day. And she had this beautiful place out in the country. She was raising her boys there. And she really blamed fracking for kind of ruining the air and water in her area. And so she became sort of mobilized to do something about it.
When my water turned black, no one came. Because if it has to do with oil and gas, no one's coming. You're on your own. So I didn't want other people to go through that.
A lot of the Permian is just miles and miles away from a public road, and the roads are just kind of built by the oil companies and off limits to the public. And so there's a lot of kind of driving around figuring out how to get places.
I don't see a sign that says no trespassing. I don't know, what do y'all think? All they can do is come at us on their four-wheeler with a rifle.
I didn't know whether we would find any methane. I mean, most of these emissions are evidence of something going wrong. Maybe we'd strike out. But, you know, Sharon has done this a lot. She was pretty confident. And we found lots of events every day. Methane, it's just kind of everywhere.
That's what the camera sees is coming up from the top of the flare, an unlit flare.
It's confounding because, of course, natural gas is a useful fuel that people pay money for. It's not really in anyone's interest to waste it. But gas is very difficult to handle. It's hard to store, it's hard to transport. It's easy for pressure to build up somewhere and you have to release it somehow. If you burn the gas, obviously that's not great for the environment because you're putting carbon dioxide into the air. But releasing it without burning it is something like 16 times as bad because then you're releasing methane rather than carbon.
Volatile organic compounds and methane gas. I wouldn't want to live downwind. Once we have the footage, we submit complaints to the TCEQ, the Texas Regulatory Agency. I've made over 240 complaints, and even if they take action, it doesn't last. But until something changes, we'll keep doing this.
A lot of other people out there are focused on what can we do to clean it up. So Environmental Defense Fund, you could think about what they're doing in the Permian as sort of like dispatching like 1,000 Sharon Wilsons. I went to Austin, Texas to visit David Lyon, who's running EDF's Permian project.
What have you found so far? We found that emissions in the Permian are very high. We find that about 5% of these flares are unlit and venting all the methane to the atmosphere, and about another 5% have combustion problems. So really we have two goals. One is to have the data inform regulators so they can design effective policies. We also want to have actions by the operators in the Permian, so they would make changes to their sites which would minimize the occurrence of those kinds of issues in the future.
If you look at what oil companies are saying publicly, they are saying almost uniformly that they're very focused on this problem.
We're wide awake about the dangers of climate change. We put very stringent targets on methane.
It's absolutely critical that we as a company get this right, and frankly, we as an industry get this right.
We are ready to curb our emissions, and we will do it together.
But in a few years, when the next boom happens, either in the Permian or somewhere else, and there's real money to be made, are they going to show the same restraint that they're pledging right now? Or are they going to focus on the short-term bottom line, which is let's just drill as fast as we can, and who cares if some methane leaks into the air?
I've been hearing their promises for over a decade. It's like forgiving your cheating lover one more time.
Up next, Turkmenistan's gas problem. The Central Asian nation spews methane in huge volumes, and it's yet unclear how its authoritarian government can be persuaded to do anything about it. We'll find out more next. This is Bloomberg Green. From Bloomberg's headquarters in New York, I'm Kaylee Lines, and this is Bloomberg Green. The world has a serious problem with methane emissions from Turkmenistan. In 2020, the International Energy Agency estimated its overall methane emissions were behind only Russia, the U.S., and Iran, all of which have significantly larger energy industries, not to mention much larger populations than the Central Asian nation's 5 million citizens. Yet, unlike those nations, it's not at all clear how Turkmenistan can be persuaded to reduce its climate impacts. Joining us now for more is Matthew Campbell from Bloomberg Businessweek. So Matt, let's talk about exactly what is happening there. What are scientists detecting?
Well, Kaylee, for a long time, methane emissions were a bit mysterious. They are invisible. They are not well monitored. This is a colorless, odorless gas. It's only in the last few years, thanks to some increasingly sophisticated satellites that are surveilling greenhouse gas emissions, that scientists have been able to really monitor methane in detail. And what they're seeing, particularly in Turkmenistan, is quite alarming. There appear to be some very large releases of methane going on from oil and gas facilities of various kinds. These can be really enormous. One leak that was observed by a company we spoke to, they estimated, or a researcher affiliated with them estimated, that it was equivalent to about 8 million cars driving around for a year. So the carbon impact of even one or two of these leaks can be very large. There is a fair bit of pressure on methane elsewhere, but not in Turkmenistan.
So these leaks can cause very large problems, but what exactly is the cause of the leaks in the first place?
Well, methane leaks from oil and gas facilities in one of three ways. The most obvious are called fugitive emissions, which is basically leaky stuff, old pipes, valves that need to be replaced, things like that. Those are difficult to detect. You might need aircraft or satellites to find those leaks, but you can replace them pretty easily. The two other ways are so-called flaring, which is when you light methane on fire because you can't use it in one way or another, and venting, which is when you just release it into the atmosphere. What is going on in Turkmenistan appears to be more or less venting on quite large scale. And from a climate perspective, that is incredibly worrying.
So let's talk about who and who doesn't care about this. What about Turkmenistan's government? What's it like?
Turkmenistan is one of the most repressive countries, certainly in Central Asia, if not in the world. It's a post-Soviet dictatorship run by a series of kind of strongman leaders, actually run by two strongman leaders since it attained independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. The current president, President Berdimuhamedov, is really in charge of everything. He is almost a parody of a dictator with complete power over every part of that society. Turkmenistan's engagement with international environmental bodies is very minimal. This is not a country that is persuadable in the way that even some of its Central Asian neighbors would be, because it's just not integrated in international institutions.
So is it then impossible to persuade the government to take action?
Nothing's impossible. And I think in the case of Turkmenistan, there is one very obvious avenue for persuading the government to look at methane emissions more seriously, and that's China. Turkmenistan's natural gas industry, which is one of the largest in the world, essentially has one major customer, which is China. There is one of the large state-owned Chinese oil companies has a big operation in Turkmenistan. The Chinese, if anyone has leverage in Ashgabat, the Turkmen capital, it is the Chinese. Xi Jinping's government has been very aggressive on climate change. And if it wanted to make an issue of methane emissions in Turkmenistan, it probably could, but that's a decision for them.
So if Turkmenistan is to be persuaded, what would they need to do? How do you go about fixing this?
Well, with methane emissions, there are two broad categories of fixes. For fugitive emissions, these are the accidental leaks that can be quite large. You just need to replace stuff. You need to go around tightening nuts and bolts to oversimplify it. As someone said to me, that this is much more in the realm of auto mechanics than rocket science. For flaring and venting, though, you do need to invest in storage and transportation capacity so you have something to do with all this methane that you would otherwise just release. That can be expensive, but it is not technically so challenging.
All right, Matthew Campbell, our Bloomberg Business Week reporter, thank you so much. That's it for this week's edition on the other greenhouse gas, methane, the new focus in the attempt to slow the pace of global warming. Make sure you check out the second part of Methane Hunters on Bloomberg Quick Take this weekend, and Bloomberg Green Magazine's 5th issue will be available from Monday. Plus, you can keep the conversation going by following us on Twitter @Climate. I'm Kaylee Lyons in New York, and this is Bloomberg Green.